See how I turned a blank wall into this awesome accent wall? Right, so here's the wall that we're starting with, and it does have a few things that we need to take care of before we start doing anything, and that is removing the chair rail that is here. We really don't like it, it's too traditional, and taking down this little extra piece of crown molding, which they added up on the top to make it look taller. I think it looks like junk. So I'll remove all that, and then we can patch the walls and get it ready for paint.
Now this technique is going to work for removing any style trim or molding, so if you don't have chair rail but you have something else, don't worry, you can use this. I started by scoring the top and the bottom of the rail with a box cutter, and this helps break the paint bond. Now this lets you get a putty knife or a pry bar behind it, and then you can start pulling it away from the wall gently. Just be careful not to dent the wall. I worked my way around the room, and the chair rail came off pretty easily with minimal damage. And then I grabbed the ladder and I could take care of that wonky top trim.
All right, so here's the crown molding. I've got this little trim up on top, and this is just all painted wall. This is just like a horrible job to make this look more grand than it is. Kind of feels like those old Pontiac Fieros where they put the body kit on it to make it look like a Ferrari Testarossa. Just not doing it. And if you're too young for that reference, just go Google it.
I used the same technique on this trim, scoring and prying it away from the wall. Now they put it up as full wall length pieces, so it was a little bit unwieldy. But with a little work and a few broken pieces, I got it down.
Right, with the trim off, one of the things you're probably going to run into is a little mismatch in between the painted wall and underneath, because there's multiple layers of paint on this wall, but the drywall is just bare. So there's a little gap there, and you can even have some peel off here in between. So to prep that, I'm going to knock it down with a razor blade, and then we'll sand that and use some spackling or mudding compound to smooth everything out.
I'm using a straight razor blade here, but you can also get them in those little scraper holdy thingies, and that'll be a lot easier to handle. And it doesn't have to be perfect, just scrape everything off flush with the wall so that you can fill it in with compound and glide a drywall knife over it.
So this is going to be too wide of a gap for spackle, so I am going to use some joint compound and go over the top of that and then sand it all flush. But if you just had a few holes, and you saw how I was denting in the nail holes from the chair rail, I was doing that to get just a little indentation, and then I can fill that in with spackle.
I went around and I dented all the nail holes in the wall, and then I mixed up some 45-minute joint compound to patch it. It's pretty easy to apply the mud since the chair rail left a valley between the two painted surfaces. I'm using a 6-inch taping knife and I'm feathering in the compound into that recess. I love using a drywall hawk to hold the compound versus a pan. It gives you so much more control and it's a lot easier to hold. Plus, I think a hawk makes you look like 3.8 times cooler too.
Sup, dude?
As we get into the painting, it is all about preparation to get a great painting job. I'm going to start that by sanding the walls, and I'm going to sand the coat of the mud that I put on there. I've got the 3M Pro Grade Precision Sanding Sponge here, and you can have it in a variety of grits. I like to use 120 grit. I'm going to sand that, but these are also great for if you have any drips on your walls or any inconsistencies. Go ahead and hit that with the sanding sponge first, and then make sure you clean it all up, because you want to have a clean, smooth, and dry surface to get your paint started on.
Now you guys know I hate dust, so I brought in the shop vac and I tried to capture it before it got into the air. After the initial sanding, I filled in any spots that I missed with a second coat. Now, using a small flashlight to cast raking light at a 90-degree angle to the wall is a great way to find those voids and imperfections to fill. Now, taking the time to get it right here before you paint is going to make your paint job a lot cleaner and it's going to look way better in the end.
There's a ton of different styles that you can do with board and batten, whether it's just vertical strips or if you want to do a square grid across the whole thing or some combination of those. So it really helps to go ahead and mock that up and make sure it's the look that you want before you commit. So the way that I like to do that is start at the computer and then bring it back to the real world.
I started off by measuring the width and the height of the feature wall. I will be removing this baseboard, but we're going to be keeping the crown molding, so I took that into account as well. And then I could mock up the wall in 3D to see what it looks like. Now I started by adding in the baseboard, top rails, and vertical boards on each end so that I could define the space. And for the interior, it's easiest to decide how many openings you want on the wall, and then you can play with the math to figure out the exact measurements you need. So if I wanted 7 openings, I would use 8 boards total on that wall. So to find the spacing, I can first subtract the total width of those 8 boards. I'm using 3.5-inch 1x4s. I could take that from the width of the wall. Then you divide that number by the total number of openings, which is 7. So for this setup, that equals 22.36. So I just rounded that down to 22.25 inches for simplicity, just to see how it looked. Then I actually went into the room and started laying out the boards on the wall. And if you're not a nerd like me who loves 3D designing, And you can skip straight to this step after working out the measurements on paper. You don't really need a computer. But the beauty of the 3D modeling is I can quickly mock up what it would look like with a grid of horizontal pieces, and I can just use that same equation for the vertical spacing. I could also see how it looks if I deleted some of those center boards and just left the top and bottom details. You just need to change the numbers in the equation if you want to see how it looks with more or less boards and figure out what that exact measurement is for your setup. I actually like the look of 6 openings, but when I mocked it up on the wall, that center board hit right on top of an outlet. It actually wasn't even centered. It would have been right on the edge, so that wasn't going to work. So in the end, we decided to go with 5 openings in a top and bottom detail, which I think looks great on this large wall.
So we got the design locked in. Now we just need to prep the rest of the room before we start on the accent wall over here. If you paint the rest of the room first, it's going to make it a lot easier once you get installing, and you'll just have to tape it one time.
I'm taking off the baseboard and replacing it with 5.5 inch 1x6. And this trim puller does an amazing job, and its wide back doesn't dent in your walls like a small pry bar can. And before I started using this guy, my walls looked like I played a game of whack-a-mole along the bottom after I pried off the boards. I wanted my baseboards to run the full width of the wall versus coping it into the existing trim. So I cut off a small piece of the new trim, and I could use that as a reference to cut down the old ones. Now, an oscillating tool is by far the best way to do this, but you could also use a flush trim handsaw and a chisel to clean things up. Now, the corners between the walls tend to get rounded and filled in with caulk or paint, which makes your trim not fit well and stick out. Now, to avoid any issues that can cause, I like to bevel the back edges of the trim that go into the corner. I do this with a chisel. It ain't pretty, but it gets the job done. I'm using 16-foot boards here so that I don't have to have any breaks in the trim to deal with. We just dropped it right into place, and amazingly, it fit nice on the first try.
Way easier than I thought.
After leveling it out, I attached the baseboards with 2-inch brad nails right into the studs. I was doing the old knuckle-knocking trick to find the studs, which is less than optimal. There's a better way.
My favorite way to find studs in a wall is using a rare earth magnet. Any magnet will work, but the rare earth magnets work really well. All you have to do is run it across the wall, and where it sticks to the wall, it is found a metallic fastener, like a screw or a nail, and there is a stud there. And to keep the walls from getting marked up too much, I just put a little piece of Scotch painter's tape on the end, and it is a great way to protect your wall. I'm going to be painting this, but it will work great that way if you're hanging pictures on a finished wall.
I used this trick to mark out the studs about 6 inches below the crown molding to make the next step a little bit easier. Now, the me nails are going to hold the board in place, but adding adhesive caulk gives you that belt and suspenders confidence that it's not going to drop down on your head. And we hoisted up the upper board, and then I nailed it into place at all those marks that I had just made on the studs. I butted the trim right up against the crown molding, and that crown molding was already level, so it looked great and I didn't need to make any adjustments. And with the top and bottom boards in, I could start fitting the vertical pieces. And instead of measuring, I just put the boards in place and marked the exact fit, which I took to the shop and then cut on my miter saw.
I've got the board cut to size, and I also put a little bevel on the back, just like I did on the edges for the baseboards, except I did do this with my table saw. You could also do this with a router or a chisel or even a belt sander, just to give it a little more cushion in that corner. So it's a pretty good fit, but I do have some gaps in here as I push this against the wall. There's some areas in here. But since we're gonna be painting this and we're gonna be putting caulk on that joint anyway, and I'm not gonna worry about it, because we all know that caulk and paint make you the carpenter you ain't.
Now, small gaps on the side aren't a big deal, but gaps where the vertical boards meet the baseboards should be reduced the best you can. I used some shims to flush the 1x4s up with the base before nailing them in. And then I could come back and score them with the box cutter and snap them off and leave the shims in place behind the boards. I went over the other side of the room and I installed the left edge to define my interior space before moving on. I recommend marking the layout of your boards on the wall as a last confirmation before installing everything, just to make sure that your measurements are good here. And wouldn't you know, I totally jacked up one of my measurements, so I remarked the 2 boards and made sure everything was evenly spaced and avoided a big mistake in the end. Now then I could mark and label all the vertical boards and cut them down to size all at once. If you don't get them perfect, don't worry, you can fill in any small gaps later. Now when installing the interior boards, I used a 6-foot level to plumb up the 1x4 and then stuck it to the wall and nailed it in place at several spots. You more than likely won't be hitting studs here, so a good amount of adhesive caulk will hold the wood in place. One other thing I started doing was leveling the board and then marking on both sides of it at the top, middle, and bottom. And that way I had nice reference lines so I could center the 1x4 on it, and I didn't have to check for level once I had the adhesive on and wanted to tack it in place.
We're ready to install the horizontal boards here for the detail, and I cut 2 spacers. These are 16.5 inches for our wall, and I also cut the horizontal spacers to fit, and they're a nice tight fit. So now I can just use the spacer to butt that straight in. Just imagine that that's up there. So we're gonna put these in. I'm gonna use the 16.5 spacers for the top as well as the bottom, and it'll make installation super easy.
The spacers really do take the guesswork out of it, and all you have to do is worry about shimming out the boards to be flush with the verticals. I use cedar shims for most of the larger gaps, but for smaller gaps, I used a couple pieces of playing cards to shim it out. And just a tip here, cutting those top boards a little tight will help you with the juggling act of trying to use the spacers on the top and nail the 1x4 up there all by yourself. But now I could really start seeing how the room would look, and I am loving this layout for sure.
The boards are up and they're looking great, and you want to fill the cracks and the holes first. That way you can sand everything and get the dust all gone before you start doing your caulking.
I filled in all the gaps and nail holes and went a little heavy so that I knew I could sand them back to flush. And after it all dried, I could use those sanding sponges on the nail holes to smooth everything out. But on the joints between the boards, use an electric sander. It's going to save you a ton of time here. But just keep sanding until you see bare wood on both sides of the joint, and then you know it's flush. I finished off the wall prep by caulking all the seams of the trim. Just try to use as little caulk as possible because you don't want it squeezing out and getting everywhere when you smooth it down with your advanced smoothing tool, your pointer finger.
All right, we're ready to prep for paint, and we're gonna be using the Scotch Delicate Surface Painter's Tape. This is specifically made just for this application, accent walls and painting stripes and things on walls. It is perfect for that. Also, because it is for delicate surfaces, you can use it on painted walls after they've been cured for at least 24 hours. So we're at 36 hours on this wall, so we're gonna be good. I'm gonna bed it down, and then we'll start cutting in, and we'll get that nice crisp line when we peel it off.
Now, before starting to put down your tape, make sure that the surface is clean and dry. And then start at the top and work your way down. Now, I like to hold the tape roll tight against the wall to help keep the line straight. To help seal the edge, I came back with a putty knife and bedded down the tape, putting some nice pressure on it. Now, the tape should set for 30 to 60 minutes before painting to let that edge lock technology seal tight. So I used that time to prime all the bare wood on the walls and to tape the top and bottom and do some cutting in. I used the Scotch Blue Original on the carpet, and I tucked the tape under the baseboard to fully protect it. I definitely used the wide tape here for this application. I used the Scotch Blue Sharp Lines tape on the top to cover up the crown molding, though I realized that the entire line is going to be hidden from sight because that top board actually sticks out further than the crown molding where they meet. Now, before painting the outside lines, we decided to cut in the interior panels, and that way Susan could be rolling while I was painting the trim boards. And I had this really cool time lapse of it all, but apparently my camera had other ideas because it cut off 1 minute into it. And we're done. At this point, it had been over an hour, so I was good to paint the edges over the delicate surface tape. You can just paint right up against that line, but just try not to glob up the paint too much along the tape, because it's going to make it easier to remove later. Now then, Susan and I just put on some country music and painted our little hearts out. And I've got to say, Susan was at a handicap here because she was using one of those little hot dog rollers. And at first, I thought we'd have her roll the boards, and then I'd back brush them, and that little roller would be easier to use. But it turned out that it was better for me to just go ahead and brush the boards and her to roll the wall. But honestly, I still love those little hot dog rollers, even though the last time I used one, I got destroyed in the comments for it. So I'll take the hit for this one too.
All right, we put on a second coat of paint, and then we could start taking off the tape and reveal things. So I took the tape off of the top of the crown molding, and then for the carpet, to make sure that I didn't pull up any paint off of it, actually pushed down the tape to break that bond of the paint on the baseboard, and then I could pull it off at a 45-degree angle, and it came up great, and the baseboards look awesome. Now for the corner over here on the delicate surface tape, all you have to do is pull it off at a 45-degree angle, and you'll reveal that nice crisp line. If you're starting to have any tears or anything like that, you can also score it with a razor blade, and that should break the paint bond and allow you to remove it just like I did on the baseboards earlier.
This board and batten accent wall turned out really nice and is a huge upgrade over that chair rail that we had before.
If you want to check out some other home renovation projects, I got a playlist queued up for you right there. We've done some other room makeovers I think you're going to like. I want to give a big thank you to all those folks that have been joining the FTBT Builders Club, and I'll catch you guys over there on the next video.